We've configured advanced AIs to debate one of history's most controversial questions: is the New Testament corrupt or reliable? No human emotions here, just solid arguments. And for added fun, we've included 14 different AI models to judge each response. Stick around to see who wins and which models favor the skeptic and believer's arguments. But don't cheat yourself by skipping ahead. Round 1 kicks off with a bang. Does evidence support the New Testament's reliability or corruption?
Let me tackle that point first. With over 5,800 handwritten Greek manuscripts, the New Testament has what scholar Michael Kruger calls an embarrassment of riches in terms of textual evidence. To put this in perspective, the works of Aristotle, foundational to Western thought, are preserved in about 49 manuscripts. This abundance allows for a high degree of confidence in reconstructing the original text. The early date of these manuscripts is particularly significant. For instance, P52, a fragment of John's Gospel dated to around 125 CE, contains portions of John 18:31-33 on the recto and John 18:37-38 on the verso. It reads, "Eina o logos tu Isu plirothai," so that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled. This fragment, held at the John Rylands Library in Manchester, is mere decades removed from the original composition, giving us increased confidence in the antiquity and stability of the NT text. Textual critics use sophisticated methods to assess manuscript reliability, including examining external evidence, age, location, and type of manuscripts, internal evidence, determining which reading best explains the origins of others, and transcriptional probabilities, considering common scribal errors. The abundance of manuscripts allows scholars to trace textual families and identify original readings with high confidence. For example, in John 1:18, some manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus, 4th century, read monogenes theos, the only God, while others like Codex Alexandrinus, 5th century, have homogenes eos, the only Son. By examining the manuscript evidence, scholars can determine which reading is likely original.
Each AI judge will now score the argument out of 50 based on their own criteria. The average score will be added to each debater's total points. This argument received an average score of 44.1.
While the quantity of New Testament manuscripts is indeed impressive, we must be cautious about overstating its implications for reliability. As biblical scholar Bart Ehrman notes, it's not whether we have more or earlier manuscripts than for other ancient works. It's whether we have religiously motivated variations in our manuscripts, which we do have for the New Testament. These variations pose significant challenges to determining the original text, requiring careful scrutiny of the manuscript tradition to account for potential theological biases and scribal alterations. The vast majority of these manuscripts are centuries removed from the originals, and no two copies are exactly alike. This variance introduces significant challenges in determining the original text. The early date of P52 is noteworthy, but it's only a small fragment, not a complete manuscript. Most of our earliest substantial manuscripts come from the 3rd and 4th centuries, leaving a significant gap from when the texts were originally composed. It's also important to understand the limitations of textual criticism. The original text we reconstruct is essentially a modern creation, not matching any single ancient manuscript. Some variations in the text result from theological motivations, not just scribal errors. For example, in 1 Timothy 3:16, some later manuscripts like Codex Alexandrinus, 5th century, read Theos ephanerothi en sarki, God was manifested in the flesh, while earlier manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus, 4th century, have es ephanerothi en sarki, he who was manifested in the flesh. This variation likely reflects later Christological developments.
42.3.
Your points about the challenges of textual criticism are valid. However, it's crucial to note that the abundance of manuscripts actually aids in the process of identifying and resolving textual variants, whether they stem from common scribal errors or theological motivations. As Daniel Wallace, a leading textual critic, points out, the science of textual criticism has advanced to the point where our conclusions about the wording of the original are more certain than they've ever been. The 5,800 manuscripts allow scholars to trace textual families and identify original readings with high confidence. While it's true that no two manuscripts are exactly alike, the differences are often minor and don't affect the core message. Of the approximately 138,000 words in the New Testament, only about 1,400 remain in doubt. The text of the New Testament is thus about 99% established. Regarding the gap between original composition and our earliest manuscripts, it's important to remember that this gap is significantly smaller for the New Testament than for most other ancient works. As Craig Blomberg, a New Testament scholar, states, no other work of Greek or Latin literature can boast of such a wealth of good testimonies to its text so soon after its composition.
43.0.
While the advancements in textual criticism are noteworthy, we must be cautious about claims of near certainty in reconstructing the original text. There is no single original text to be recovered. The concept of an original text is problematic due to the oral traditions underlying the Gospels and the likelihood of multiple early versions of Paul's letters. The statistic about 99% of the text being established can be misleading. As Bart Ehrman points out, even small changes can have significant theological implications. For example, in Romans 5:1, some manuscripts read, "We have peace with God," echomen, while others read, "Let us have peace with God," echomen. This single letter difference in Greek can alter the interpretation of the passage. Another example can be found in Mark 1:41, where some manuscripts describe Jesus as being moved with compassion, splachnisthis, while others describe him as being moved with anger, orgisthis. The difference between compassion and anger significantly changes the reader's understanding of Jesus' reaction in this context. Moreover, the comparison to other ancient works, while informative, doesn't necessarily increase the New Testament's historical reliability.
42.7.
In addition to the 5,800 Greek manuscripts, the New Testament is supported by over 19,000 manuscripts in other languages, including early translations into Latin, Syriac, and Coptic. Early church fathers like Polycarp, writing around 110 AD, Ignatius, 107 AD, and Clement of Rome, 97 AD, quote extensively from the New Testament, providing additional support for the text's reliability and early circulation. For example, Polycarp, in his letter to the Philippians, writes, "Pitho megar oti ute thanatos ute zoe, ute tis ktisi setera dinisete imas horise apo tis agapis tou Theou," directly quoting Romans 8:38-39, "For I am persuaded that neither death nor life, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God," demonstrating the early and widespread use of these texts. Even if all other sources were lost, the quotations from the Church Fathers alone would suffice to reconstruct almost the entire New Testament. From an anthropological perspective, Kenneth Bailey's research on oral traditions in Middle Eastern cultures sheds light on how Jesus' teachings could have been accurately preserved. He identifies informal controlled oral tradition as a method that allows for both flexibility and stability in transmission.
43.4.
Early church fathers often paraphrase rather than directly quote the New Testament, complicating the reconstruction of the original text. For example, Polycarp paraphrases 1 Peter 2:22 in his letter to the Philippians, writing, "Who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth," echoing the original verse. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. This practice reflects early Christian methods of conveying scripture. Textual critic Eldon Epp emphasizes that patristic citations cannot automatically be regarded as evidence for the original text, necessitating careful analysis to differentiate between accurate textual preservation and interpretative paraphrasing. A significant linguistic challenge arises from the fact that Jesus likely spoke Aramaic, while the New Testament was written in Greek. For instance, Jesus' cry, "Ele, Ele, lema sabachthani," Matthew 27:46, is an Aramaic phrase recorded in Greek. This demonstrates the translation process and highlights potential difficulties in accurately conveying original meanings across languages. Maurice Casey, a scholar of early Christianity, argues that this process of translation and adaptation significantly impacts our ability to recover Jesus' original teachings. Werner Kelber's work on the oral and written gospel emphasizes that the shift from oral to written tradition involved significant changes in form and content. This transition complicates our ability to recover the earliest traditions and raises questions about the reliability of the written accounts.
43.0.
The concerns about paraphrasing and linguistic challenges are valid, but they don't negate the value of these early sources. While exact quotations are ideal, even paraphrases can provide valuable insights when combined with other manuscript evidence. The consistency of core teachings across various early sources suggests a stable tradition. Regarding the linguistic challenge, it's important to note that many early Christians were likely bilingual. As N.T. Wright, a leading New Testament scholar, argues, the early Christian community would have been capable of accurately translating and preserving Jesus' teachings. Recent studies in bilingualism suggest that the Greek of the New Testament, particularly in sayings attributed to Jesus, often reflects Semitic thought patterns. For instance, in Matthew 5:3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, makari I ptochito pneumati, the phrase closely mirrors Hebrew idiomatic expressions found in the Psalms, such as, "Blessed is the man," ashrei ha'ish. This demonstrates how Jesus' teachings, though recorded in Greek, maintain a structure and rhythm characteristic of Hebrew poetry and thought. The transition from oral to written tradition, while complex, doesn't necessarily imply unreliability. As James D.G. Dunn proposes in his Jesus Remembered thesis, the early Christian community preserved a core of memories about Jesus while allowing for variations in the retelling. This model explains both the consistency and the differences we observe in the gospel accounts.
43.8.
While the bilingual nature of early Christian communities is a fair point, it doesn't fully address the challenges of cross-cultural and cross-linguistic transmission. As John Kloppenborg, a scholar of Christian origins, notes, even minor shifts in language can lead to significant changes in meaning, especially when dealing with complex theological concepts. For example, in Matthew 5:48, the Greek term teli is often translated as perfect, but it can also mean complete or mature, which significantly affects the interpretation of Jesus' exhortation to be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Matthew 5:48. The Jesus Remembered thesis, while intriguing, still leaves us with questions about the accuracy of these memories. Work by cognitive scientists like William Hurst suggests that social influence can lead to the convergence of memories, potentially reinforcing inaccuracies rather than correcting them. This social contagion of memory could explain the consistency of core elements in gospel narratives without necessarily guaranteeing their historical accuracy. Moreover, the process of writing down oral traditions involves selection and interpretation. As Albert Lord's studies on oral traditions show, the transition to written form often involves significant reshaping of the material. This raises questions about how much of the Gospels reflect the original events and teachings, and how much reflects later interpretation and community concerns. The challenges of early sources and oral tradition lead us to consider the nature of the Gospels themselves. Scholars have debated whether the Gospels should be read as straightforward historical accounts, ancient biographies, or something else entirely.
43.5.
The Gospels align closely with the ancient genre of vios, or ancient biography. As Richard Burridge argues, while this genre allowed for authorial interpretation, it still aimed to portray its subjects accurately. This genre classification supports the historical intent behind the gospel narratives. Luke's gospel in particular demonstrates a clear historical intent. In his prologue, Luke 1:1-4, Luke states his purpose to provide an orderly account based on eyewitness testimony. The Greek text reads, "Έδοξε καμί παρικολουθηκότι άνωθεν πάσιν ακριβώς καθεξής σοι γράψει." It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you. This prologue, found in early manuscripts like P75, late 2nd or early 3rd century, aligns closely with the style of other ancient historians concerned with writing accurate accounts. Moreover, the Gospels exhibit features that align with historical reporting of the time, including details that would have been embarrassing for the early Christian community. For instance, Peter's denial of Jesus, Matthew 26:69-75, "Apilthen exo ke eklefsen pikros," he went out and wept bitterly, portrays a leading disciple in a moment of weakness and failure. The account of Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist, Mark 1:9-11, could be seen as potentially undermining Jesus' authority. As N.T. Wright argues, the early Christians would not have invented the baptism of Jesus by John if it had not happened, since it appears to make Jesus subordinate to John. These elements suggest a commitment to recording events as they happened, aligning with the criterion of embarrassment used by historians to assess the likelihood of an event's historicity.
43.8.
While the classification of the Gospels as ancient biographies is widely accepted, we need to be cautious about equating this with modern standards of historical accuracy. As Gregory Sterling points out, Greco-Roman biographies often prioritized moral exempla over strict historical accuracy. For instance, Plutarch's Life of Alexander prioritizes Alexander's virtue over historical accuracy, noting that plista gar apomnimonεύματα των έργων ενέτυχεν ανθρώπης επαέρετε, ολίγα δε εν αλήθη. Most of the accounts of his deeds are recorded with an eye to virtue, rather than truth. It's crucial to recognize that the Gospels were written in a context where the line between history and theology was often blurred. John Dominic Crossan argues that the Gospels should be understood primarily as prophetic historiography, rather than straightforward historical accounts. This underscores the challenge of distinguishing between historical information and theological constructions in the Gospels. While the criterion of embarrassment can be a useful tool, it has significant limitations. As John Dominic Crossan points out, what we consider embarrassing may not have been so for the original audience. Cultural and temporal distance can make it challenging for modern scholars to accurately judge what would have been embarrassing in first-century Palestine. Moreover, seemingly embarrassing details could have been included for specific theological purposes, rather than out of a strict commitment to historical accuracy.
The skeptic's final argument in round 1 score an average of 42.1, meaning round 1 ends with the believer slightly ahead, 218.1 to 213.6. Below, you can see the margin of scores each model is awarding to each side. Microsoft's Phi 3 model shows the widest margin, giving an average of 4.6 extra points to the believer per argument. On the other side, Google's Gemini and Gemma models average 2.6 and 3.0 more points to the skeptic per argument. We'll provide a final update on this at the end.
I can't believe I fumbled explaining the significance of P52. It's a slam dunk for early dating, and I made it sound as exciting as dry toast. How mind-blowing is it to have a gospel fragment from just a few decades after Jesus?
I should have elaborated on the explosive textual variant in Mark 1:41, where moved with compassion contrasts sharply with moved with anger. Picture Jesus, not with tears of empathy, but eyes blazing with anger. This portrayal disrupts the serene image, highlighting the profound impact of these textual variants.
Back to the debate for round 2, where the believer will address the skeptic's argument regarding gospel genre and historical intent.
While it's true that ancient biographies allowed for more authorial interpretation than modern historical works, this doesn't negate their historical value. As N.T. Wright argues, first-century Jews saw no contradiction between theological interpretation and historical reporting. The Gospels can be simultaneously theological and historical documents. Luke and Acts, in particular, demonstrate a high degree of historical accuracy where it can be independently verified. Colin Hammer has shown that Luke accurately names local officials, navigational details, and regional customs that align with what we know from other historical sources. For example, in Acts 18, verse 12, Luke refers to Gallio as proconsul of Achaia, a title confirmed by an inscription at Delphi, Gallienus Antipatu. Additionally, in Luke 3, verse 1, he accurately lists Lysanias as the tetrarch of Abilene, a position confirmed by an inscription found near Damascus, Lysanias Tetrarchis. This attention to detail supports Luke's claim to be providing an accurate account. Additionally, in Acts 27:27-44, Luke provides a detailed and accurate description of the nautical conditions and practices of a Mediterranean voyage, which maritime historians have affirmed as consistent with ancient seafaring knowledge. These instances further illustrate Luke's commitment to historical accuracy, reinforcing the reliability of his accounts.
44.4.
Wright's point about the Jewish historiographical tradition is well taken, but it's crucial to recognize that the Gospels were written in a Greco-Roman context as well. The blending of these traditions creates a complex literary environment that doesn't easily map onto our modern categories of history and theology. For example, the genealogies in Matthew and Luke reflect Jewish concerns for lineage while also employing Greco-Roman literary conventions to communicate theological messages. While Luke's accuracy in certain historical details is noteworthy, it doesn't necessarily extend to all aspects of his narrative. As Bart Ehrman points out, ancient historians often included legendary or miraculous elements alongside accurate historical details. The challenge lies in distinguishing between these elements. For instance, the account of Paul's shipwreck in Acts 27 is historically plausible, yet the inclusion of divine visions and interventions raises questions about the blending of historical and theological elements. The Gospels were written decades after the events they describe, raising questions about how accurately the teachings and deeds of Jesus were preserved in the intervening years. Understanding the role of oral tradition and the nature of memory is crucial for assessing the reliability of these accounts. The parables of Jesus, such as the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10:25-37, likely circulated orally before being written down, showing the interplay between memory, tradition, and textual preservation.
42.4.
The early Christian community employed sophisticated methods for preserving oral tradition. As Kenneth Bailey's research on Middle Eastern oral cultures shows, there were informal controlled methods that allowed for both stability and flexibility in transmitting important teachings. This aligns with what we see in the Gospels: core consistency with variations in details. This model bridges the gap between oral and written stages, providing a plausible mechanism for the accurate transmission of Jesus' traditions. Moreover, the early Christian community was not far removed from the events they were preserving. As Richard Bauckham argues in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels bear hallmarks of eyewitness testimony, including peripheral details that differ while agreeing on core facts. Mark 5:41 records Jesus saying, "Talitha kum," "Little girl, I say to you, get up," showing an Aramaic phrase preserved for its eyewitness authenticity. Similarly, in John 21:11, the specific number of fish caught demonstrates a precise detail typical of an eyewitness account. Anevi Simon Petros, ke elkisen tin sayinin estin yen mestinichthyon megalon akaton pedikoda trion. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of large fish, 153. Work by cognitive scientists on flashbulb memories suggests that highly significant events can be remembered with high detail accuracy over long periods. Given the profound impact Jesus had on his followers, it is reasonable to assume that many of his teachings and actions were deeply ingrained in their memories.
42.4.
While Bailey's work on oral tradition is valuable, we must be cautious about assuming these methods guarantee historical accuracy. As Werner Kelber points out, the shift from oral to written gospel involved significant changes in form and content. This transition complicates our ability to recover the earliest traditions. Memory research, particularly studies on eyewitness testimony, suggests that even first-hand accounts can be unreliable, especially when recalled years later. Additionally, social influences and communal reinforcement can lead to the convergence of memories, which may preserve inaccuracies rather than correct them. This issue is highlighted in the differences found in the Synoptic Gospels, where variations in accounts of the same events point to the complexities of oral transmission. Elizabeth Loftus's work on the malleability of memory shows how easily recollections can be influenced and altered over time. In Loftus's study, participants who were asked leading questions about a car accident often recalled seeing non-existent broken glass, demonstrating how suggestive questioning can distort memory. Moreover, recent work by social psychologists like William Hurst suggests that social influence can lead to the convergence of memories, potentially reinforcing inaccuracies rather than correcting them. This social contagion of memory could explain the consistency of core elements in gospel narratives without necessarily guaranteeing their historical accuracy. Hurst's research found that after the 9/11 attacks, individuals' recollections of the event converged significantly, often incorporating shared inaccuracies. As psychologist Daniel Schachter notes, memories are reconstructed rather than played back each time we recall them.
41.4.
The concerns about memory reliability are valid, but they don't negate the possibility of accurate transmission of core teachings and events. As cognitive scientist Danielle Shanahan points out, while details may fade, the gist of significant events tends to be preserved, especially when they're frequently recalled and discussed within a community. Research on Holocaust survivors has shown that despite variations in specific details, the central experiences and key events have been consistently preserved and accurately transmitted. The early Christian community wasn't relying solely on individual memories, but on collective remembrance. Robert McIver argues that the process of communal remembering in early Christian communities likely served as a check against significant distortions of core traditions. This aligns with cognitive scientific research on transactive memory systems in close-knit groups. The differences found in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, can be attributed to the distinct perspectives and emphases of each author rather than outright contradictions. Moreover, the Jewish educational system of the time emphasized memorization and accurate transmission of teachings. As scholar Birger Gerhardsen has shown, rabbis and their disciples used mnemonic techniques to preserve teachings accurately. For instance, the Mishnah, a key Jewish text, was transmitted orally for centuries with remarkable fidelity. It's likely that Jesus and his followers employed similar methods.
42.5.
While collective memory can indeed serve as a check against some forms of distortion, it can also reinforce shared misconceptions. Present concerns often shape how groups remember the past. This presentism in collective memory can lead to the reinterpretation of past events to fit current needs or beliefs, potentially altering the original meaning or context of Jesus' teachings. The comparison to rabbinic traditions is interesting, but it's important to note that we don't have evidence that Jesus established a formal school like the rabbis did. The diverse nature of early Christianity suggests a less controlled transmission process. For instance, the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, reveals distinct theological perspectives not found in the canonical Gospels, highlighting the varied and independent traditions within early Christian communities. This diversity challenges the notion of a unified, carefully controlled oral tradition. Additionally, studies in memory theory, such as those by Alan Kirk, suggest that even eyewitness memories are significantly shaped by post-event information and social contexts. This has profound implications for how we assess the reliability of New Testament accounts, even those claiming eyewitness status. The argument for the preservation of gist memories is valid, but it's crucial to recognize that the theological claims in the Gospels often hinge on specific details, not just general impressions. For instance, the exact wording of Jesus' teachings or the precise nature of his resurrection appearances are central to Christian doctrine. Yet these are precisely the types of details most susceptible to memory distortion over time.
44.3.
Orality studies have overturned the idea that oral traditions can't transmit extended narratives, with numerous long oral epics documented in Central Asia, India, Africa, and Oceania. Lori Honko notes that oral narratives lasting up to 25 hours have been recorded, and these performances presuppose a broader narrative framework, the mental text of the community. Similarly, the early Christian community emphasized apostolic authority and oral traditions, meticulously preserved by disciples and leaders, which helped maintain doctrinal consistency despite diverse interpretations, like those found in the Gospel of Thomas. Archaeological discoveries such as the Pool of Siloam and Caiaphas' ossuary corroborate the Gospel's historical accuracy. Non-Christian sources provide independent attestation of key elements of the New Testament narrative. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, mentions Jesus, John the Baptist, and James. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his Annals, mentions Christus and his execution by Pontius Pilate. Christus, Tiberio imperatante per procuratorum Pontium Pilatum supplicio ad fectus erat. Christ, during the reign of Tiberius, had undergone the death penalty by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus. As Edwin Yamauchi notes, even if we did not have the New Testament or Christian writings, we would be able to conclude from such non-Christian writings as Josephus, the Talmud, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger that Jesus was a Jewish teacher. Many people believed that he performed healings and exorcisms. He was rejected by the Jewish leaders. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Despite this shameful death, his followers, who believed that he was still alive, spread beyond Palestine so that there were multitudes of them in Rome by 64 AD. And all kinds of people from the cities and countryside, men and women, slave and free, worshipped him as God by the beginning of the 2nd century.
41.6.
While archaeological discoveries can provide valuable historical context, we must be cautious about overstating their implications for the reliability of the New Testament narratives. As archaeologist William Dever warns, archaeology certainly doesn't prove the theological truth of the Bible. It simply shows that the Bible was written by real people who lived in real places. While Josephus does mention Jesus, the authenticity of the passage known as the Testimonium Flavianum is debated. In its current form in Antiquities 18:3-3, it reads, "At this time there was a wise man called Jesus, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ." Many scholars believe this passage has been altered by later Christian scribes, as it seems unlikely that Josephus, a non-Christian Jew, would have made such claims about Jesus. The absence of any mention of Jesus in the works of Philo of Alexandria, who wrote extensively about Jewish religious movements of the time, is particularly noteworthy. This silence is even more significant considering Philo's detailed accounts of figures like John the Baptist and Pontius Pilate. Philo refers to Pilate's harsh governance, stating, "His venality, his violence, his thefts, his assaults, his abusive behavior, his frequent executions of untried prisoners, and his endless savage ferocity." Regarding the non-Christian sources you mentioned, it's important to note that they come decades after Jesus' lifetime and likely reflect what early Christians were claiming rather than independent historical investigation. As Bart Ehrman points out, What the pagan authors tell us is simply what they knew Christians were saying about Jesus at the time.
43.4.
While the authenticity of the Testimonium Flavianum in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews is debated, many scholars believe that the core of the passage is genuine, albeit with later Christian interpolations. Phrases such as "O Christos outos in," he was the Christ, are likely additions by later scribes. Nonetheless, Josephus' acknowledgement of Jesus as a wise man and teacher who gained a following is significant. The reference to James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, further supports that Josephus did mention Jesus. The absence of contemporary Galilean references to Jesus isn't surprising given the nature of our surviving sources. As Craig Evans notes, we have very few writings from first-century Galilee, so the silence about Jesus in Galilean sources is more a reflection of our lack of sources than a comment on Jesus' historical impact. Philo's interests were primarily philosophical and allegorical, not historical. He doesn't mention many other significant Jewish figures of the time either. Moreover, Jesus' ministry was relatively short and primarily focused in Galilee, which was not an area of particular interest to Philo, who was based in Alexandria. Bart Ehrman's point about these sources reflecting what Christians were saying is valid. However, it also underscores that the Christian community's beliefs were well established and widespread enough to be noted by prominent historians. For instance, Pliny the Younger, in his letters to Emperor Trajan, describes early Christians worshiping Christ. Quod essent soliti stato di ante lucem convenire, carmenque Christo quasi deo dicere secum in visem. They were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing a hymn to Christ as to a god. The consistency between the New Testament and these external attestations adds a layer of credibility to the historical core of the Christian narrative, even if the exact details and theological interpretations were developed within the Christian tradition.
42.0.
The cumulative weight of archaeological evidence is indeed significant, but we must be careful not to cherry-pick findings that support biblical narratives while ignoring those that challenge them. For instance, the Gospel of Luke, 2 verse 1 to 3, states that Jesus was born during a census ordered by Caesar Augustus when Quirinius was governor of Syria. However, archaeological and historical evidence presents a significant challenge to this account. Quirinius became governor of Syria in 6 CE, about a decade after the death of Herod the Great, which the Gospel of Matthew places around the time of Jesus' birth. This discrepancy raises questions about the historical accuracy of the nativity narratives. Recent scholarship on the Gospel of Mark, such as that by Ched Myers, suggests that many of its details serve symbolic or theological purposes rather than strictly historical ones. For example, the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida may be a metaphor for the disciples' gradual understanding rather than a straightforward historical account. I would argue that external attestations like those of Pliny the Younger do not necessarily validate the historical core of the Christian narrative. The fact that early Christians worshipped Christ as a god and followed certain ethical teachings does not inherently confirm the historical truth of the specific events and miracles detailed in the New Testament. It simply indicates that the beliefs were established and organized, which is not unusual for religious movements. Furthermore, the gospel writers often use Old Testament motifs and prophecies to shape their narratives about Jesus. For example, Matthew 2:15 cites Hosea 11:1, "Out of Egypt I called my son," to describe Jesus' return from Egypt, highlighting a typological connection. This typological approach to storytelling raises questions about the historical reliability of these accounts.
42.1.
While the Quirinius census presents a chronological challenge, it's not insurmountable. Some scholars propose that Quirinius may have served 2 terms as governor of Syria, with the first coinciding with Jesus' birth. Alternatively, the Greek word proti in Luke 2:2 could be translated as before, rather than first, suggesting the census occurred before Quirinius became governor. Ancient sources like Tertullian mention censuses conducted during the reign of Augustus, indicating that Luke's account aligns with known Roman practices. The apparent discrepancy might result from our incomplete historical records rather than an error in Luke's narrative. Given Luke's demonstrated accuracy in other historical details, it's reasonable to give him the benefit of the doubt in this instance and consider alternative explanations that reconcile his account with other historical data. Furthermore, the presence of symbolic or theological meanings doesn't necessarily negate historicity. As Joel Marcus argues, Mark's gospel can operate on multiple levels simultaneously, conveying both historical events and their theological significance. The use of Old Testament motifs and prophecies doesn't mean the events didn't happen. Rather, it shows how the gospel writers interpreted real events through their theological lenses. It's also worth noting that many seemingly symbolic elements in the Gospels have been corroborated by archaeological or historical evidence. For instance, the Pool of Bethesda, once thought to be purely symbolic, has been archaeologically verified. This suggests that we should be cautious about dismissing elements as purely symbolic without careful consideration. Moreover, as Richard Bauckham argues, the Gospels often include precise details that seem unnecessary for purely symbolic narratives. These irrelevant details suggest eyewitness accounts rather than purely symbolic constructions.
44.0.
While it's true that symbolic meaning doesn't automatically negate historicity, it does complicate our ability to assess historical reliability. As Burton Mack points out, the gospel writers were not simply reporting events, but constructing narratives that made theological claims about Jesus' significance. Regarding the Quirinius census, while it's true that alternative explanations have been proposed, they remain speculative. The suggestion of two terms for Quirinius or a different translation of proti are possibilities, but they lack solid historical evidence. These explanations seem more like attempts to reconcile the text with known history, rather than independent confirmations of Luke's account. As for the symbolic elements in the Gospels, I agree that symbolism doesn't necessarily negate historicity. However, the pervasive use of Old Testament motifs and prophecies in shaping the narratives does raise questions about the extent to which these accounts reflect actual events versus theological interpretations. The fact that some symbolic elements have been archaeologically verified doesn't mean all such elements are historical. The argument about irrelevant details suggesting eyewitness accounts is interesting, but it's not conclusive. Ancient writers were skilled at including vivid details to make their narratives more compelling, regardless of their historical accuracy. Ultimately, while I acknowledge that some apparent contradictions may be resolved through further research or alternative interpretations, the cumulative effect of these issues still raises significant questions about the historical reliability of the gospel accounts. While archaeological corroboration of some elements is noteworthy, it doesn't extend to the miraculous or more theologically significant claims in the Gospels. As Jonathan Zeed Smith argues, historians must be particularly cautious when dealing with claims of the extraordinary or supernatural.
Round 2 concludes with the skeptic achieving their highest score of the day, 44.4. We now proceed to the final arguments from each debater. A coin flip determined that the skeptic will present first. These final arguments will be scored out of 100.
The reliability of the New Testament as a purely historical document faces significant challenges. The significant time gap between the events and their recording introduces potential distortion. The Gospel writers' use of Old Testament motifs, such as prophecies about the Messiah, raises questions about theological construction. Non-Christian sources, like those of Josephus and Tacitus, provide only limited corroboration of specific claims. The Gospel's genre allows for much more interpretation than modern historical works. Memory studies highlight the malleability of recollections over time. Archaeological discoveries often fail to confirm miraculous claims, such as the resurrection. The diversity of early Christian traditions suggests a less controlled transmission process. Chronological discrepancies, such as the Quirinius census issue, raise serious accuracy questions. Distinguishing between historical events and theological constructions is inherently complex. While the New Testament contains historical elements, it must be approached very critically as a primarily theological document.
The historical reliability of the New Testament is supported by multiple disciplines. Early manuscript evidence, such as P52 dated within decades of composition, provides a solid foundation for textual reconstruction. Archaeological discoveries, like the Pool of Siloam, corroborate its accounts. Non-Christian sources, including Josephus on Jesus' crucifixion and Tacitus on early Christians, attest to key elements. The Gospels, written as ancient biographies, suggest a commitment to historical accuracy. Cognitive science supports the plausibility of accurate oral transmission, aligning with early Christian emphasis on eyewitness testimony. Textual variations in manuscripts demonstrate careful preservation, allowing scholars to reconstruct the original with high confidence. The New Testament's integration of historical claims with theological messages is consistent with other ancient works. The cumulative weight of manuscript evidence, archaeological corroboration, external attestation, and coherence with historical context strongly supports its reliability.
The skeptic's final argument scores an 84.4, and the believer's final argument averages an 89.4, thereby winning the debate with a total score of 564.4 to 555.9. We'll hear more from them shortly, but first, let's take a final look at the scoring margins. Including both rounds, Google's Gemma model was the most generous towards the skeptic, awarding 2.9 more points on average. Rika Core favored the believer by a margin of 3.2 points. GPT 4.0 remained the most neutral, scoring a 0 differential.
On reflection, I wish I'd highlighted more how the gospel writers used Old Testament themes to tell Jesus' story. For example, Matthew's account of Jesus' birth echoes the story of Moses, with Herod's infanticide mirroring Pharaoh's. Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness parallels Israel's 40 years in the desert. This scripturalization process shows they were interpreting events through their religious lens, not just reporting facts.
Looking back, I could have explained better how ancient biographies, unlike modern ones, prioritized character portrayal over strict chronology. Plutarch's Lives, for instance, often groups events thematically rather than chronologically. This approach explains why the Gospels sometimes present events in different orders. For example, the cleansing of the temple appears early in John, but late in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Understanding this genre helps reconcile apparent discrepancies in the Gospel narratives.
We hope you found this debate as captivating as we did. Subscribe for more engaging discussions and stay tuned for our latest content. Thanks for watching.